Hello everyone. So in the previous video I made to you a quick review on the male reproductive system, so now the female reproductive. And so from anatomy perspective, here is the uterus, the fallopian tubes, and then the cervix, and then we go to the other side. Okay, and we have the gonads, which are the ovaries, and here is the vagina. And so the lining of the uterus, that will be the endometrium, and then of course we have the myometrium. The endometrium is responsive to estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen proliferate and progesterone increases the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle and increase the glycogen secretion, softens it, and that is obvious in pregnancy, also during the late phase of the menstrual phase. The lumen or the cavity of the uterus is exaggerated here. It's usually really close. There is not really air or cavity here, but I'm just exaggerating it in this drawing. So let's take the ovary and let's talk about what kind of cells do we have. And so we do have 3 cells, and so we have the gametes, which are the ova. So let's start with that. So we have the ova, and the ova are arrested in the meiotic arrest, the first meiotic arrest. That means they're duplicated chromosomes already, but they did not undergo the meiosis, and all of them are the same. That's why the ova, the gametes in the female, are not dividing after birth. On the contrary, a lot of ova start to die. Follicles will commit atresia or apoptosis, and we start with 4 million and ending up with about 300,000 around the age of puberty, and that's just due to atresia. Now, when does the meiosis get completed? Well, the first meiotic division is induced by the LH surge, that is in the mid-ovulatory, in the mid-menstrual cycle, in order to induce ovulation. So that will cause the first meiotic arrest or the first division to occur, the first meiotic division. And the secondary meiotic division will occur if those eggs get fertilized. And so because this is a meiotic division, it's really not a full cell. One cell will acquire most of the cytoplasm, whereas the other one will have what we call the polar body. And the same thing here, when this one divides, also we will get the egg and then the polar body, where one egg will get the cytoplasm. So here this would be a sperm or the fertilization. So that's the effect of the fertilization, will cause the secondary meiosis to be completed. That's pretty much it about the ova. So we talked about the number, about 300,000, and they are surrounded with flat cells. And so this is the primordial follicle, and it's surrounded by flat cells. We call it the primordial follicle. Under the effect of estrogen, these cells here will start to change and they will become cuboidal. So we go from this stage into, and the ova keeps, of course, getting bigger with time, and that will be your primary follicle, and these would be now granulosa cells. And so FSH will, did I say they will respond to estrogen? No, they will respond to FSH, and they will become granulosa cells, and they secrete estrogen at this point. But how do they secrete the estrogen? At least initially, not from a scratch. They are only capable of aromatizing existing androgen. And so we do have here what we call interstitial cells, or the theca cells, and the theca cells are the ones that give androgen, and that will be androstenedione. and that will be aromatized by the granulosa cells into estrogen. Another thing, the FSH will induce few things inside the granulosa cells. So FSH, that's follicle stimulating hormone, if you remember, it will induce the aromatase. Therefore, they will acquire the capability of making estrogen. It will also increase LH receptor, and therefore when it comes to the mid-cycle, they will respond very well to the LH, and 3-beta HSD is also increased. And so this is the primary follicle, and then the primary follicle, these cells now will grow even more and will form multiple layers, and then we will have a clear zone here. We call that the zona pellucida. That will be very important for the fertilization later on, and the egg just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, accumulating cholesterol, accumulating proteins inside, and it's in directed passes because the follicle now is like that, and so the nutrition has to pass through gap junctions through the granulosa cells into, and then the zona pellucida and into the egg. Later on, this will start to have openings or vacuoles inside, and the vacuoles will coalesce together, and now it will become a big, what we call antrum. So therefore this is the antral follicle, and will keep growing, and it will become the Graafian follicle, and then that is the one that bursts under the effect of the LH surge, and we'll talk about the hormones in a second, and then leaving behind two things, the unfertilized egg, but now because it already was exposed to the LH surge, it is in the second meiotic arrest, so already committed the first meiosis, the first act of meiosis, and now it's just waiting for the sperm to commit the second act of meiosis, and it's surrounded by the zona pellucida, and then above that we will have a little bit of not anymore granulosa cells, but we call that luteal cells because they have been luteinized by the effect of LH and FSH, and they secrete estrogen and progesterone. Similarly, the leftover of the Graafian follicle after the rupture, after the ovulation, we call that the corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is important because it gives you estrogen and progesterone, and those will continue throughout the first few weeks of pregnancy. This is under the effect of HCG that is coming from the fertilized egg, from the chorion, human chorionic gonadotropin, and then later on the hormones that are coming from here will be substituted by the placenta. If pregnancy does not occur, then this initially will give you estrogen and progesterone for a little bit of time, but then it will start going into apoptosis because the LH and the FSH will go down. Keep in mind that the estrogen that's being secreted here is under the effect of LH, and so therefore when you inhibit the LH, then the estrogen and progesterone will go down, but also this will start dying, and that's what we call corpora albicans or corpus albicans, and it will become just a scar tissue. A lot of eggs, a lot of follicles will start maturing. That's part of the follicular cycle. A lot of them will escape the primordial stage and they will go to primary stage, but only one, normally one, sometimes two, would ovulate. And so what happened to the remaining, so let's say 100 will start exiting the meiotic arrest and they will start to develop. What happens then later on to the rest? They will just commit atresia. Why do we pick only one from the others? Well, there are theories behind that. Either it has better blood supply, or it's the one that has better FSH receptor, or what else? I think that's the main wisdom now. These are the ones that will exit or escape apoptosis, whereas the others will not continue the whole way, and then they will just commit apoptosis instead. Okay, so let's talk about the hormonal regulation here. And so we agreed that we have two cell system, and we have the theca cells and we have the granulosa cells. Initially the granulosa cells, this is the theca cells, is not capable of making estrogen from a scratch. Instead, it relies on the androstenedione that is being made here, and that will be converted into estrone, and estrone can be converted back and forth to estradiol, and that's by 17 alpha hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1 and type 2. Type 1 converts it to estradiol, type 2 converts it to estrone, but it's really relying on the androstenedione. The theca cells are under the effect of LH, the granulosa cells are under the effect of FSH. Later on, the granulosa cells will acquire LH receptor. Therefore, the luteinized cells, or the LH primed cells, will have both FSH and LH receptor. Now, talking about the hormone and the ovarian cycle of the hormone. So we have the first day of the menstrual cycle. So day 1 is the first day of the menses, of the menstruation, and in which the FSH is going to start rising. It's going to start picking up. Why is that? Because the estrogen is now at rock bottom, and therefore the inhibition for the FSH is lifted, and you will start to see a steady increase in the FSH levels. So I'm going to try to make it with different colors here. And what about the LH? The LH is also going to start increasing, although it's a little bit later, and then it will start picking up, and then mid-ovulatory you will have a big peak in the LH. Is the FSH also going up? Yes, but that's not as important. Although there are a lot of things that we don't know, but anyways, this is the LH surge that happens mid-ovulatory cycle. So let's talk here what's going on with the estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen will keep building up and building up and building up, and then towards this here it will have a big surge. So it's really this big estrogen, this is E2, estradiol, is the one that caused the GnRH surge here, and the LH and the FSH surge that we see. This will go down a little bit, but then it will start increasing again as we go through the cycle. And then if there is no fertilization, then the corpus luteum will start fading and will start dying, and with it dying, then the endometrium will slough away, and then we're starting a whole new cycle again from day 0. What about the progesterone? Well, progesterone is going to be extremely low. Some people are saying that there is a little bit of an increase here, but then it really starts increasing in the second half of the cycle before it also fades away. This will be the progesterone phase, and the progesterone phase is the one that's responsible for the secretory phase of the uterus. Also, the progesterone is responsible for the relaxation of the opening of the fallopian tube, or the isthmus of the fallopian tube, and therefore the fertilized egg now can go, because it makes sense. The progesterone, it's the hormone that prepares the uterus for the gestation, and so now the uterus is ready to receive the fertilized egg. So it makes sense that this progesterone is the one that increases the relaxation in the fallopian tube, and therefore the fertilized egg can pass into the uterus. Estrogen initially is causing proliferation of the endometrium lining, but estrogen, as you know, has a lot of other functions as well, and also the motility of the fallopian tube. But then later on, the progesterone increases the secretion and the glandular formation, a lot of glycogen, because that glycogen will be very important for the fertilized zygote before it starts burying in and burying itself inside the endometrium. It needs to live on the glycogen supply that was initiated by progesterone. Later on in pregnancy, estrogen increases the contractility of the uterus because it stimulates the myocytes. So myocyte contractility, whereas the progesterone decreases it. So without the progesterone, there will be miscarriage, and we know that female women who have low progesterone levels, they are at the risk of spontaneous miscarriage. During pregnancy, progesterone also is responsible for other things. So let's talk about just reproductive functions of estrogen progesterone. One of the things about the estrogen is it increases the water secretion in the vagina, also the secretion in the cervical mucus, and so the mucus plug becomes watery and thin, and that allows the sperms to get in, whereas progesterone will cause thickening and changing of the characteristics of this mucus plug, and therefore the sperms cannot go in. And that these are the basics of progesterone only contraceptive drugs, because they block the ability of the sperms, not 100%, but they block most of the sperms from entering into the uterine cavity. Estrogen is important for the maintenance of pregnancy, same thing with progesterone, but later on estrogen is needed for the maturation of the smooth cells, the myocytes in the uterus, proliferation myocytes. Increase the myocytes proliferation, increase the contractility, and we said before the progesterone counteracts this. Later in pregnancy, so early in pregnancy, you have more progesterone than estrogen, but later on you have more estrogen than progesterone. At that point, it's not really estradiol, instead it's estriol, and which is converted from the DHEA. So what about the progesterone during pregnancy? Any other functions other than that? Yes, because the placenta, here is the placenta and here is the umbilical cord. The placenta will give progesterone, and the progesterone will go to the fetus. This is here the fetus, and it will go to the adrenal gland, where the progesterone will be converted into, it will give you cortisol, but it will also give you DHEA. So cortisol, and will give you DHEA. Well, the DHEA will go back to the placenta and will get aromatized. First of all, it will remove the sulfate, and then it will get aromatized, and that will produce to you the E3. When the adrenal gland is maturing, then the cortisol is going to start also inducing changes. First in the fetus, maturation of the lungs, maturation of the brain, but also it will induce changes in the placenta, increasing what we call E3 to P ratio. You will have more E3 than P, and that will start to have increased contractility of the uterine myocytes here in preparation for the labor. It will increase the gap junctions between the smooth cells, and it will increase the oxytocin receptors on the smooth cells. So when the oxytocin start increasing, then we will have unified syncytial kind of contraction from the uterine muscles for the labor. Sounds good? So I think I covered good amount here, other than other hormones that are being made by the placenta. So one of the things that we talked about earlier, which is HCG, that is important for the maintenance of the pregnancy, but the board likes to ask you a question on its effect also on the thyroid, because it does increase the thyroid production because it has TSH properties. So it can increase the amount of thyroid hormone, but it also increases the thyroid binding globulin. So the total amount of thyroid hormones in the blood will be increased, but the person is not going to suffer from hyperthyroidism because you have both the thyroid hormone being increased, but the thyroid binding globulin also is being increased. And then there is the human placental lactogen hormone, and we have other hormones like parathyroid-like hormones and other relaxin and other hormones. I doubt that these will be big on your board. So this was again a quick overview on the female reproduction. One last thing here is that the progesterone, and some people say both progesterone and estrogen, are the reason that stops the milk secretion. So even though prolactin is high and the breast is ready to start making and producing milk, estrogen and progesterone, primarily progesterone, will suppress the milk production, but once the delivery of the placenta takes place, then the milk production will start. So the colostrum does not start except after delivery. So this was a very quick run through in the female reproductive physiology. Hopefully you can find this useful as you prepare for your board examination. Best of luck. Have a good day.